Good morning. My name is Stan Dutile. I work with the LSU AgCenter as a county agent in Lafayette. I'm working with Andrew Granger today to do a presentation for y'all on cattle producer tips on dealing with storms and floods. I know Andrew's already covered some of this information. I know he specifically spoke about dealing with saltwater floods, which actually is a more difficult problem than dealing with freshwater floods. But depending upon where you are geographically in the state of Louisiana, if you're further away from the coast, you probably won't have a saltwater flood issue, but you could very well have freshwater flooding problems, and we've seen those here in Lafayette in 2016, and I know in other parts of the state even more recently than that. Several of the things that Andrew pointed out in terms of dealing with saltwater floods apply to freshwater floods just as well. The key is realizing what cattle needs in terms of nutrition. Again, if you have a freshwater flood, they can probably drink some of the flood water and in a lot of cases still be okay. It's not nearly as bad as drinking salt water, but we got to make sure that we've got adequate nutrition for the cattle, and that we make sure we have plenty of feed and hay available for them while they're under flooded conditions. This becomes a very difficult challenge sometimes. Andrew talked about high ground. That's very important. We've got to find a dry spot for the cattle to be able to rest and recover. And I know Andrew talked about a number of other issues as well, but one thing I think he maybe failed to mention was what we see in terms of calf crop losses and rebreeding losses the following year. Anytime that we have a flood, whether it's a freshwater flood or a saltwater flood, that's definitely a lot of stress on the animals. So a lot of times we can see additional reproductive problems in terms of abortions for the current calf crop, and also maybe delayed rebreeding depending upon the severity of the flood, the amount of stress that the livestock are under, and also the amount of time that it takes for the water to drain off, and how fast we get from flooded conditions to non-flooded conditions. Again, another issue has to do with how fast you can expect the forage to return. Again, it depends upon the season of the year and how fast the water gets off the land. If you have even a freshwater flood in the fall or late summer, you probably won't have anything come back till the following spring, so that just further lengthens out the time that you have to deal with some of the flooding issues that can adversely affect livestock. So just a few additional points on dealing with freshwater flooding as compared to saltwater flooding. Along the lines of flooding, we're kind of in the opposite direction. A lot of times we're faced with drought, and as a number of our producers and a lot of the general public are aware, everything that we're hearing about climate change and the weather conditions, I'm not really sure what's causing all that, but except that we do seem to have more severe weather outbreaks, and one of those is drought. Drought is kind of a double-edged sword. Again, it depends upon the time of the year. Most of the time this is seen sometimes in the summertime. If we've had a good chance to cut and rake and bale hay prior to the drought, certainly we might have some stored feedstuffs available. But if the drought comes early in the season, we haven't had a chance to make a whole lot of hay, then we don't have that as a particular feeding option, which means stored feeds and feedstuffs become more important and more critical. Another thing that's very important as we start moving into a drought, or actually any time of the year, is really stocking rates and the inventory of our livestock on the land. If we're consistently trying to carry more animals than the carrying capacity of the property, then we're always going to have problems, and then we're going to even have greater problems we have years of drought. So a good tip for producers is always to try to make sure that you're not overstocked and that you have enough land available for the amount of livestock that you're trying to run. Another question sometimes in our part of the world is irrigation possible? Well, sometimes the better question is it practical? If you're in a situation where you're a rice farmer and you have the ability to flood some of your pastures or your fields, or any other type of operation where you have irrigation as a possibility, that might be an option, but just to start setting up irrigation in drought conditions for livestock is probably not a real practical situation. Again, once you get into the drought, we have to worry about stored feeds, we have to worry about hay, we have to worry about supplementation, and about trying to get those cows through that drought period. A lot of times we don't know how long it's going to last. That's why sometimes it can even be worse than flooding, because it may last for a week, it might last for months and months. So just a difficult challenge for us. As we move into a drought, we need to be kind of concerned about the body condition of our cattle And so it's a pretty good idea to BCS score your cattle each time that you kind of work them, so you have a general idea on the condition of your herd. If the drought seems to get extended over time, you may want to consider early weaning, getting the calves off of the cows at smaller or lighter weights, so that we can actually give the cows some relief, because a cow that's lactating needs a considerable amount of more nutrition as compared to a cow that's dry and non-lactating. So that's a potential idea. Drought situation or drought strategy might be early weaning the calves. Another idea sometimes is culling part of our cow herd. Again, this is more of a last resort, because traditionally when we have drought in a particular area, then a lot of folks are considering that option, and cattle prices are normally suppressed. So it's probably a good idea to have your eyes on the market, or figure out if you can maybe capture some type of market where you won't have to try to sell directly into a lowered market because of drought. Sometimes you might want to be considering doing this even early if you can anticipate that a drought may be coming. And again, it goes back to the deal about not trying or about trying to avoid being overstocked and having a higher animal inventory than what your pastures can tolerate. So just a couple of pointers on drought and how to deal with that if you see yourself getting into a drought situation. The final topic we'd like to discuss today regarding storms and flooding is something that we've experienced here in Louisiana this year in early 2021, and that's winter storms. It seems like we don't have this problem down here quite so often, but 2021, the first part of the year, was definitely one of those particular occasions, and it came in mid-late February, so that was even a bigger surprise for us down here. One of the key things is thinking about what happens if my power goes out. Well, certainly if you have water wells that are electricity driven, we need to consider that. What are we going to do? We have to have a water source. That's one of the main things, even in the ice storm. So we've got to be able to break ice or have available fresh water for cattle at all times. This becomes a challenge to get out in the cold and break ice, or to make sure you have running water for the cattle, but this is something that's very, very important. Cattle may not need as much fresh water in the wintertime as they do in the summer, but they definitely need water, and it can adversely affect them if they don't have it. Another thing in terms of dealing with cold weather is certainly shelter if you have it available, and if you don't, at least windbreaks. Sometimes even windrows of round bales just outside of the cattle fence can create a windbreak, but this can really have a lot to do with the cattle's ability to be able to tolerate cold weather, especially when it's cold, nasty, rainy weather. Another issue that we caused some problems for us this year, a lot of our calves are what we call spring calves, but in Louisiana that goes like from January all the way through March, April. So we had some calves being born in this cold weather, and anytime that you calve in cold weather, that's another potential problem. Again, it would be really good if you could bring up any cows that are fixing to calve close to shelter or close to the barn, where you can monitor them more closely. Even in cold weather, if cattle are out on the pasture and it's not too wet, a cow can lay down and have a calf if she's a good mom and gets up and licks off that calf, and the calf gets up and nurses and can dry off fairly quickly. Those calves normally have a pretty good chance for success, depending upon how cold it is and how wet it is. Again, nutrition becomes very, very important. So for the mom to have good milk, and or for any of the other adult animals and or calves, we got to supplement them. So if we know that a cold snap is coming, and it's going to be very, very cold, especially the type of weather we had here earlier this year, it becomes important to start supplementing them earlier or sooner rather than later. As much as a week or 2 weeks ahead of time, if you can start getting some additional groceries in those animals and start getting them to build up their strength a little bit, because a lot of times in late winter our cows are kind of already run down. So this becomes very important. Make sure you have enough supplemental feed, and then make sure that you have enough hay where you have hay in front of them at all times. A lot of times we can have a lot of poor quality hay in front of our animals, but that doesn't do us a whole lot of good. If we have a 5% protein hay, we've got to have some type of supplemental feeding to allow them to be able to eat enough poor quality hay in terms of protein and energy, so they can break down that poor quality hay. Another real important factor is remembering kind of the critical temperatures for cattle. When a cow is dry, and she's it can get to be fairly cold, especially in the late winter when she's got a really heavy coat on and it's dry. Sometimes the research says 18 to 20 degrees. She can tolerate that with no problem, even if it's a dry snow. But when we start getting wet weather, a lot of producers are surprised to realize that a cow's critical temperature when her hide and her hair are soaked is only 59 degrees. If they're dry, again, kind of a fall coat, 45 degrees, and then midwinter coat, probably 32 degrees. As long as they're dry, they can deal with that. But when we start having these cold, rainy days when it's in the mid-30s, that's what I call cow killing weather, because it'll actually there's an old saying that January shakes them, February breaks them, and March takes them, and that goes back to that particular issue about the types of weather we have in South Louisiana at those times of the year. So probably the last point I'd like to make is that, what is this cold weather going to do to our winter pasture if we're fortunate to have any winter pasture? Well, two things that really become important. One is your ryegrass varieties, or the winter pasture varieties you have. Did you plant something that was cold tolerant? As y'all know, a lot of people in South Louisiana plant Gulf. Gulf is one of the least cold tolerant varieties. Sometimes we pay extra money for some of these other varieties that have more cold tolerance. But in a year like February of 2021, that was very important. And another thing has to do with how we manage the grass, right before and after the freeze. If you've got a really tall ryegrass that's fixing to lay over, it's probably a good idea to put your cows on and try to graze it off, down to a couple of inches before the freeze. If you don't get a chance to do that, then it'd probably be good to try to wait maybe a week or 10 days and get that excess forage grazed off as soon as you can after the freeze is over, to where the cattle don't trample it so much. They at least get some nutrition out of the forage that's there. So all of these things are important factors that should be considered anytime that you're dealing with the winter storms.